Work hard, play by the rules, and you will be recognized for what you achieve, what you earn, what you give back and contribute to the greatest nation in the history of the world. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Hawaii.
I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today in strong opposition to Amendment 115, the Toomey Amendment. This amendment would reduce funding for the advanced drop-in biofuel production. I strongly oppose this amendment for several reasons. First, this amendment undermines our long-term national security. The 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review outlines several areas where reforms are imperative to improving our national security. Implementing reforms to strengthen our energy security was one of these areas. Right now, our military is almost totally dependent on fossil fuels. These resources are finite, priced on a global marketplace, and produced by nations with whom we don't always see eye to eye. There are also new powers rising and new challenges evolving. So to preserve a 21st century force, we need to invest in 21st century priorities. This means that we must diversify how we power our military. The project that this amendment seeks to cut is fairly modest in the scheme of the military budget, but their overall benefits to our forces will be well worth it. Our nation has always invested in technologies that produce long-term benefits and address changing circumstances, from more advanced tanks and aircraft to faster communications and lighter armor. We have to innovate now in order for our military to have the capabilities to protect our nation. We need to make the same kind of investments now in our military's long-term energy needs. Already, the research and deployment of alternative energy is benefiting our long-term capabilities, improving troop safety, and making security operations more affordable. In fact, just last summer, at the Rim of the Pacific exercise, RIMPAC, the U.S. Navy demonstrated its Great Green Fleet, with surface combatants and aircraft using advanced biofuels for the first time. This exercise, the largest international exercise in the world, proves that our military platforms can use this fuel. Prior to this exercise, Navy Secretary Ray Mabus said of the biofuel demonstration, quote, "The Navy has always led the nation in transforming the way we use energy, not because it's popular, but because it makes us better war fighters," end quote. Clearly, continuing to support this type of investment will pay additional dividends that will help ensure the U.S. remains the world's preeminent military and technological power in the 21st century. However, there is another reason to oppose this amendment and support the military's ongoing efforts to improve its energy security. That reason is that it makes good long-run budgetary sense. Fossil fuels are a finite resource that is priced in a global market. Increasingly, as I mentioned, this fuel is produced by nations with whom we don't see eye to eye. As global competition for fuel resources intensifies, it is vital that we reduce the amount necessary to power our military. Not only does our reliance on fossil fuels constrain our assets and resources from an operational perspective, it also puts significant strains on already stretched budgets. For example, between fiscal year 2005 and fiscal year 2011, the Department of Defense spending on petroleum rose from $4.5 billion to $17.3 billion. That is a 381% increase. And while that number is shocking, another shocking fact is that during this time, the Department of Defense was actually using 4% less petroleum. In other words, we're paying nearly 4 times more money for less fuel. In addition, global price spikes make budgeting for our current energy costs extremely challenging. According to the Navy, every time oil prices rise by $1, their fuel budget inflates by $30 million. In fiscal year 2012, the U.S. Pacific Command, which is based in Hawaii, faced a $200 million shortfall in operation and maintenance funds. This is directly related to spiking fuel costs. These unforeseen circumstances reduce our military's capabilities and readiness. It is also unsustainable in today's budget environment. So while the senator from Pennsylvania argues that biofuels are too expensive now, new technologies are always more expensive at first. That's exactly why we need to invest in scaling up instead of scaling back. The first fighter jets off the assembly line are always more expensive than the 100th fighter off that line. The fact is that it's the height of irresponsibility for us to rely on fuel sources with such unstable costs. That's why the military is already working to reduce its fossil fuel usage and to develop and deploy alternatives wherever possible. At the U.S. Pacific Command, investments in renewable energy, energy-efficient buildings, and fuel cell or hybrid vehicles are making installations more cost-effective. In fact, PACOM expects to reduce its reliance on fossil fuels for electricity by 80%. That would reduce the total DOD electricity demand in Hawaii by 34% and save the DOD $42 million per year in electricity costs. This $42 million could be put to better uses. These are savings that can be replicated on a service-wide scale and will save far more money that could be used to support O&M than the Toomey Amendment will. The military recognizes this. This is why General James Mathis has stated, quote, "I remain committed to unleash the burden of fuel from our operational and tactical commanders to the greatest extent possible," end quote. These investments are about improving our national security by changing the way we power our military. Advanced biofuels is an investment in that goal, and one we should continue. As U.S. Marine Corps General John Allen has said, quote, "Operational energy equates exactly to operational capability. Let's all work this hard together," end quote. So I urge my colleagues to vote against the Toomey Amendment. I yield the floor.
Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I too rise, as my colleague from Hawaii just rose, to speak in support of the Department of Defense and in opposition to the amendment offered by the senator from Pennsylvania. As been outlined, this amendment would strike funding for a very important and effective Navy program which now works with private industry along with the Department of Energy and the Department of Agriculture to produce alternative fuels. And as we work together to overcome the harm that's been done by sequestration, it's essential that we provide the military with the flexibility to overcome current and future threats. And that includes allowing the DOD to invest in energy sources and fuel technologies that reduce our dependence on foreign oil. And unfortunately, the Toomey Amendment does the opposite. And in so doing, it would do real harm to our military. It would cost more money than it saves, Mr. President, and it would damage the military's strong and necessary efforts to reduce its dependence on foreign oil. Mr. President, carrying out the work of our nation, the Department of Defense consumes approximately 330,000 barrels of oil every single day. That works out to be 120 million barrels per year. What does that cost us, Mr. President? Well, last year the military spent over $16 billion on fuel. Because of rising global oil prices, that was about $2.5 billion more than they'd forecast. That is a lot of money, Mr. President. Those rising costs in dollars and in operational capability, they're staggering. I think that's the only word that applies. If you think about it, for every 25% increase in the price per gallon of oil, the military's fuel bill increases by $1 billion. And in order to make up for that shortfall, then the DOD has to pull money from operations and maintenance, which means that rising fuel costs result in less training, deferred maintenance, and reduced operational capability. That's a terrible triad if there ever was one. And that means that our troops then are also less prepared when they go into harm's way. They're less ready to fight when it matters most. The Toomey Amendment would undercut efforts to end that cycle. It would delay the development of technologies that would clearly bring lower costs, less domestic production, and fewer American jobs. And that's why the DOD is investing in these domestic alternatives to foreign oil. And it should tell us something, Mr. President, in an era of reduced Department of Defense budgets, that our senior leaders remain fully committed to this effort. Even when we've got to tighten our belts, they think this is an investment that really makes sense. What are we doing? Well, we're investing in research and development that will develop new fuels that can be made from biological feedstocks. These are fuels that can be grown and then refined here at home. And, Mr. President, I want to be clear, these aren't programs that are being forced on the DOD through earmarks or environmentalists or other groups that some like to demonize. These are DOD initiatives undertaken to protect the military from rising fuel costs in an increasingly volatile international marketplace. So even under the threat of sequestration, investments in new energy technologies and alternative fuels remain a priority. And I'd say to my friends who say we can't afford to spend money on alternative fuels, our uniformed senior leaders tell us that we can't afford not to. Think about it another way. We send $300 billion overseas every year for oil. If we could keep about 1/20% of that money at home, we'd pay for this program. For about half of what we spend on military bands each year, we could be establishing a domestic energy industry. For about 1/6 of the cost of this year's funding for the MEADS missile system, a system that the DOD has no intention of putting into operational use, we could diversify our energy portfolio and drive down costs. We'd be taking billions out of the hands of terrorists and reducing the risk at the same time to our military personnel. Now, Mr. President, the proponents for cutting off these investments in alternative fuels would argue that the Defense Department should not be involved in the development of new energy sources. I couldn't disagree more. Let me tell you why. These biofuels couldn't be used as leverage against us. The refineries couldn't be taken over by al-Qaeda-backed extremists or blockaded by Iranian gunboats. Energy security is national security. And this is exactly the right kind of investment that our military should be making. Just think historically. Military R&D has sustained the enormous technological advantage that we maintain over our adversaries. Our willingness to invest in the future has helped keep us safe. It's also been said that the DOD shouldn't be spending money on energy development. And if that were the case, we wouldn't have a nuclear-powered Navy. Without military investment in emerging technologies, we wouldn't have jet engines, microchips, microwave ovens, radar, or GPS navigation. Ensuring our energy security ought to be a national priority. Our reliance on foreign oil is a threat to our security and our economy, and I'd suggest even our very way of life. We need a whole-of-America solution to this national problem, and the Department of Defense absolutely has a critical role to play in that effort. If you believe that the DOD has a vested interest in having reliable sources of fuel and energy, then you should agree they have a role to play in ensuring that new fuels meet their needs. As I mentioned, we're all concerned about the effect of sequestration on our troops. But we can't solve our problems with the same kind of short-sighted thinking that got us here in the first place. Killing the Navy's biofuels program, Mr. President, make no mistake, that's exactly what this amendment would do, will cost more money than it saves. It will set back an industry that's poised to provide our country with enormous and important benefits. And it will ensure that we keep pouring money into foreign coffers. So I want to urge my colleagues to continue to support smart investments in our future, like the Navy's biofuels initiative. And therefore, I urge my colleagues to oppose the Toomey Amendment. Mr. President, thank you for your attention. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kansas.
Mr. President, thank you. I'm here to speak to an amendment that I'd previously filed, Amendment number 41. The purpose of this amendment is to help provide the White House with the opportunity to reopen its doors to the American people. Certainly received a lot of attention, which demonstrates to me, and I'm sure to my colleagues, how important a visit to the White House is to so many Americans. In my view, we can be much smarter, and we must be much smarter with our spending decisions and make cuts in ways that do not intentionally or unnecessarily inflict hardship or aggravation upon the citizens of our country. Canceling White House tours is one of those unnecessary and unfair ways for the Department of Homeland Security to meet its budget-cutting obligations, particularly if the necessary savings can be found someplace else within their budget. The self-guided White House tours were canceled either by the Secret Service or the White House. I have not been able to get a clear answer to actually who made that decision. But regardless, they were canceled in order to save a minimum of $2.14 million, according to the Secret Service. This amendment proposes to transfer $2.5 million from TSA to the U.S. Secret Service to pay for the security staff necessary for the White House tours to continue for the remainder of FY 2013. Why go after TSA? In my view, TSA can absorb these costs. Just last week, TSA signed a contract. Just last week, TSA signed a contract that would allow it to spend up to $50 million on uniforms related to the expenses of over the course of the next 2 years. So last week, TSA spends $50 million for new uniforms, and now we have no money for tours at the White House. Prior to signing that $50 million uniform contract, the TSA uniform allowance for security officers had already doubled last November as part of a new TSA collective bargaining agreement to an estimated $9.57 million annually. This works out to $443 per TSA employee per year. By comparison, officers in the United States Armed Forces receive either no uniform allowance or a one-time $400 allowance over the lifetime of their service. There's no reason why American taxpayers should spend more on TSA uniforms every year than a United States Marine Corps lieutenant spends in a lifetime. And the same taxpayers who are funding the TSA officers' uniforms are being denied now the opportunity to tour the White House, the People's House. This amendment has been scored by CBO, which found it would result in no net change in budget authority and would result in an estimated decrease in FY 2013 of outlays of $1 million. So it's an amendment that saves money. These White House tour closings are actually falling on the burden of members of Congress because it's our responsibility to organize the tours, get the permission, and we're the ones who are now telling our constituents that tours that were previously approved, we have to call and give them the bad news. In fact, today I had a couple of Kansans and their 3 young boys on the Capitol steps for a photograph and a conversation, and the constituent was the family from Kansas was indicating how sad it was to tell their boys they no longer, even though they were here in Washington, D.C., they couldn't see the White House. And in fact, they said, you know, we played by the rules, we signed up, we went through the security. For months we've been coming to Washington, D.C., but we now arrive, and the White House is something that's not available to us and to our boys. it's often that we're the ones now providing that news to families in Kansas and across the country. My office has received lots of emails from concerned constituents, and including some whose tours aren't even scheduled till next May or June, sometime in the summer, asking whether or not we believe that the White House will be reopened to them by that time. Between March 9th and March the 21st, just in that short period of time, we've already canceled 16 previously approved White House tours. Multiply that, assuming that we're normal or average, that you multiply that by 100 Senate offices and 435 House members, that's a lot of Americans who had hoped, had thought they were going to see the White House on their visit to our nation's capital. I read today that the White House has indicated that they're going to try to find ways. I think the President said he's going to try to find ways to get young people, children, into the White House. And I certainly express my desire to see that happen, but I was thinking, if we make that the case, then what happens to the Kansan who's the 91-year-old World War II veteran who's back here to see the World War II memorial and while here wants to see the White House? Again, the White House should be available to all Americans, in fact, people from around the globe, to see the home of our President. Shaking up our entire touring scheduling process at a time in which the tourists are soon coming or coming now with spring break and cherry blossoms is something, in my view, that we can avoid. And this amendment would take money that we believe is less wisely spent and reopen the White House to the American people. So I appreciate the opportunity to explain my amendment and would hope that we can find a way in working with the White House and working with the Secret Service to make sure that noble building at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is something that is available for Americans to see, to view, and to be inspired. One of those kids, one of those folks who walk through that White House someday will be the President of the United States. And we do not want to do anything that hinders the opportunity for that inspiration to occur and for Americans to continue to be proud in their executive officer, the President, and to be proud of the system of government we have. Let's not lose the inspiration. Let's not deny the American taxpayer, the American family, the opportunity to see the White House at 1600 Pennsylvania. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that Major Steve Warren, a U.S. Army officer who currently serves as Defense Legislative Fellow in my office, be granted floor privileges for the duration of consideration of H.R. 933.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I chair the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and in that capacity I want to take just a couple of minutes to speak against the Toomey Amendment, that's Amendment 115, that would slash, in effect, the biofuels program at the Department of Defense. And of course, we are going to hear that this will save money, that with the sequester and a very tough set of financial circumstances, the President of the Senate knows all too well, the argument will be we cannot afford to have this biofuels program in the Department of Defense. My argument, Mr. President, would be we cannot afford not to have this program. And I'm going to take just a couple of minutes and try to describe why that is the case. Right now, the Department of Defense is the single largest user of energy in our country, with annual fuel expenditures in excess of $16 billion. So you have this massive need for energy at the Pentagon, really a thirst for energy at the Pentagon, and fluctuations in global energy prices have, in effect, enormous effects on defense spending. Every $10 increase in a barrel of oil costs the American military annually an extra $1.3 billion. Now, for some time, there has been a recognition among military experts, and some are in the President's home state, Massachusetts, where they have spent a lot of time looking at these issues, and there's been a recognition that the military, particularly the Pentagon, is exactly the place where we ought to be looking for fresh, innovative approaches in order to cut energy use and find alternative sources. Now, for the life of me, I cannot figure out how somehow this effort by the Pentagon, let me repeat, by our country's military, has somehow been conflated into some kind of green plot, some kind of plot by those who are obsessed with green energy and are simply interested in promoting programs to satisfy their ideological interests. I can tell you, Mr. President, that the reason this is being pursued at the Pentagon is not because this is somehow some sort of green plot, some sort of subversive green plot. This is being pursued at the Pentagon because they have made the judgment that these kinds of alternative fuels and supporting them is a pivotal national security matter. This isn't about some kind of ideological green agenda. This is about national security, and their judgment is that we need exactly this kind of effort. And DoD contracts are particularly crucial because they help promote research and development efforts. What we have seen repeatedly is a lot of the most exciting alternative fuels. The biofuels have enormous potential, and the challenge is to keep driving down the cost and do it in a cost-effective kind of way. That is exactly what goes on now at the Department of Defense as it relates to biofuels, and it is exactly what would be undermined if the Toomey Amendment, the Amendment 115, was passed and signed into law. Last point I'd make, Mr. President, is Bloomberg, which has a new energy finance unit, a special unit that looks at these issues. Their analysts predict that some aviation biofuels are going to be cost competitive with standard jet fuel in just a few years. That will happen, Mr. President, if we don't undermine current development rates in this area of biofuels at the Department of Defense. That's why, Mr. President and colleagues, I feel so strongly about opposing the Toomey Amendment on biofuels at the Pentagon. I hope my colleagues will agree. Mr. President, with that, I would yield the balance of my time. And I would also, Mr. President, the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate has been off and on with amendments and votes to the continuing resolution funding the federal government through the end of the fiscal year. The second day of debate on the CR in the U.S. Senate, and we are in a quorum call, obviously. Also on Capitol Hill today, the Senate Budget Committee has been meeting through much of the day, marking up their 2014 budget plan, and during this quorum call, we'll take you over there live. They are expected to wrap up work this evening.
which is very important since we're broke, but I also believe this could be done. To have a dramatic increase, 60%, inflation, we're told by CBO, will be 25%. We should be able to contain the growth of these programs by that much, and this would allow that to happen, and I would urge my colleagues to support it.
Well, Senator Sessions, I know you're concerned about spending on safety net programs. I've heard you talk about that. But really, contrary to the statements on this matter, these programs aren't contributing to our long-term fiscal challenges. I want to put a chart up on the screen, and I would like to note that we've been in this since 9 o'clock this morning. This is the first chart I put up. I just want to note that.
You're catching up with me.
If we can put the chart up on the screen that we have on this. You'll see in just a second that spending on most low-income programs, do we have that chart? We're going to get it. Okay. You'll see when this goes up that spending on, see, we can't even get a chart up right. This is bad. Do we have it? Senator Conrad is just dying right now. Yes, probably. Okay, here you go. Well, as you can see on this, spending on most of our low-income programs increased temporarily, no surprise, as a result of the Great Recession. I mean, that's how these programs are designed, to deal with these people who are unexpectedly put into really tough situations, and it did expand. We know a lot of folks needed a hand up at that time. That's not surprising. But you will see on this, as the economy recovers and families get back on their feet, the demand for these safety net programs is going to decline. Spending on non-health, low-income programs will decline as a share of the economy over the next decade and will get actually below their historical average. The figure of 80% growth that we hear in welfare programs that Senator Sessions has talked about, you should know includes health programs, education programs, and several other programs that are not considered welfare programs. This amendment that he is offering, I think, would foolishly cut the earned income tax credit, which a Wall Street Journal column recently recommended to be expanded because it works so well at pulling people out of poverty. It would cut child nutrition programs, and I see that Senator Stabenow is here. She's been a strong advocate for that. It would cut unemployment insurance, something that has saved many families as they have gone through the recent crisis, and a lot of programs for vulnerable Americans at a time when we have high unemployment and poverty. Now, I've made it very clear that I believe these programs help fulfill our moral obligation to the most vulnerable in this country. This budget that we're putting out should not do anything to increase poverty in America. So I strongly urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment that Senator Sessions has offered. Is there further debate?
Madam Chairman, that's a percentage of GDP figure. That's not actual numbers. The 10 largest programs, based on the analysis we have, shows that they'll increase by 80%. We've been growing very rapidly in these programs. So nobody is talking about cutting a dime. There is a resistance on behalf of the majority in the Senate to any reduction of any program that deals with welfare or support. Food stamps have gone from $20 billion in 2001 to $80 billion. That's 4 times it's gone up. I don't say that people who need food shouldn't get it. I have my doubts that we can justify that kind of growth. There's a chart that shows that we can justify that kind of growth. Other programs are growing also. At a time when we're going broke, is 60% growth too much? 2.5 times what the inflation rate would be? I just would say, I believe that it's not rational for us to reject any oversight on the programs that are out there helping the poor and needy, because a lot of them are not working well, a lot of them could be improved, and there's a lot of fraud and abuse. I was a federal prosecutor. I prosecuted fraud and abuse in those programs. I personally tried cases before the jury. As Attorney General, we had a task force that identified fraud. It was constant. We didn't have nearly enough people to identify the amount of fraud that was going on. So there's a lot of ways we can confront these programs and help make them better without taking a single dime from a person really in need. That's all I'm saying. So this amendment would put us in a position to confront those issues, and also we need to reestablish and reconnect with the successful theory of the 1996 welfare reform that really did help people. The Brookings Institution, you know, the liberal think tank group with skills and integrity, they found that after accounting for total income, the poverty rate among single mothers declined from 37% in 1990 to 25% in 1999 after the bill passed. And they had a number of other reports that found positive impacts from the 1996 legislation. So I guess what I'm saying to you is I'm aware that the sequester touched none, had no reductions in food stamps, no reductions in Medicaid. They were totally protected. But it's time for us to say, can't we allow growth to continue at a very substantial rate, but at a more reasonable rate?
Well, Senator Sessions, I believe your chart includes Medicaid spending, correct?
Yes, it includes Medicaid. That's a means-tested program to help poor people.
Well, I think we should remember that seniors living in nursing homes, which we have an aging population and a cost that is real because of what we have in terms of our population today, is included in his chart. By the end of the decade, we're going to have 12 million people, mostly low-income, childless adults who are going to get health care insurance coverage under this program. I think it's the wrong way to go to tell them that we're not going to be a compassionate country that is there for them.
Well, it offends me for you to suggest that a reduction in growth in spending from 80% to 60% suggests that I don't care about people. I reject that. It's time for us to be above that, Madam Chairman. And I know we can do better for poor people if we run these programs better. And they've been on autopilot for too long, and it's time for us to be honest about it.
Well, what I am suggesting is that we can't arbitrarily tell the country that we're not going to have continued growth in the number of seniors who are aging and who are in our Medicaid population and need health care and coverage under the Medicaid program. So I disagree with your premise and, again, oppose the amendment and ask if there's any further debate. Senator King.
I just have a question. It's not really debated. It's a kind of first-year question about the process that we're engaged in here. I think, on balance, bipartisan legislation is better than single-party legislation. And my question to Senator Sessions and his colleagues are, you folks have put forward a lot of amendments, some of which I find appealing. The question is, if some of those amendments are accepted, will you vote for the bill? Because if you ultimately aren't going to vote for the bill, I mean, I'm just trying to understand what's going on here. I think it would be preferable to have a bipartisan bill coming out of the Senate. I think it would be great with the conference with the House. And so the question is, are there amendments that would improve the package to the extent that you would vote for the bill? Otherwise, I mean, you understand the question.
That's a good question, and I would answer it partially this way. I remember Senator Gregg, when I first got on the committee, said this is going to be a partisan budget. And I said, what do you mean? The Democrats, I think, had the majority at that time. And he said they're going to write the budget without our input. They're going to bring it up and they're going to pass it. Our duty will be to raise the issues we think are important for the country because they've got the votes to pass it. So you've set up a procedure rejecting our advice and moved having amendments on one day. You've written a budget without input from this side, and it's been done before, Republicans and Democrats. But in the past, there were more open hearings and a lot of changes occurred during the markup, I'm told, before I got here, before I got on the committee. And so you raise a valuable point, but that's where we are.
Senator Wyden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just be brief. On this point, and again it goes to the nature of health care, and Senator Crapo made some good points, and Senator Sessions, I clearly want to end up where you are in terms of reform. My concern is this across-the-board approach, just going from 80%, to 60%, I think really misses the point, and I just wanted to highlight one example that really drives it home. Our governor, John Kitzhaber, has just entered into an agreement with the federal government to actually, on Medicaid, for our most vulnerable people, have a 2% decrease in per capita spending. This is the first of its kind. Hasn't been done anywhere. And in the agreement with the federal government, if our state doesn't meet the target, the waiver is just considered null and void. And the governor sometimes kids, when he went to the Governors Association recently, all kinds of governors said they were interested in what Oregon was doing. And when he told them that he had accepted such stringent spending restrictions, he said, nobody called me back, because they all saw that when you're really talking about the nuts and bolts of reducing health care spending and doing it in a way that doesn't hurt people, it's going to be those kinds of governors, Democrats and Republicans, I might add, who will step up and be willing to take a strong stand to do it. And I don't think we'll have the ability to work with those kind of innovative governors of both political parties when you just have an across-the-board cut. So I want to get where you're going, and I think that's a valid point. I just think across-the-board cuts mean fewer Democratic and fewer Republican governors will step up and do the kinds of pioneering work that we're seeing in our state. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Further debate, Senator Graham.
In my opening statement, I tried to acknowledge where we'd wind up. I don't think any Democrats voted for the Ryan budget. I don't think any of us are going to vote. My $53 billion savings in Medicare, I'll be the first to admit, won't get my vote. It's just kind of an exercise of what's possible around here. And I can understand why y'all wouldn't want to vote for it in isolation, because we've got to do some revenue. I'm just trying to put on the table that I'm willing. I mean, the $250,000 income is probably going to vote more for me than you. So I'm asking people who are generally in my constituency, I see the need to give. That's really why I'm trying to do this. But to Senator Wyden's point about across-the-board cuts, that's why I am so worried about what we're doing to the military. 2/3 of the budget is exempt for sequestration. If you think that there's a problem with what Senator Sessions proposed, and you may actually be right, look what we have done to the 1/3 that is subject to across-the-board cuts. We're absolutely killing. And the military budget, the personnel accounts are exempted. So it's like 13% on non-pay accounts. This is a good discussion for us to continue. I hope you understand that what you're worried about, we have done in spades to the military and to the other discretionary accounts.
But just to wrap up the discussion on this, I just want to point out that all the bipartisan commissions that have met and worked on budget, Bowles-Simpson, Domenici-Rivlin, Gang of Six, all had a core value of protecting the most vulnerable. And I think that's a core value that we all should carry forward. So again, Senator Sessions,
I share that, but it doesn't mean no program ever gets trimmed. Surely not.
Is there further debate?
Madam Chairman, I'd like to respond to Senator King's question, because the question was really, can we get to bipartisanship around here? And could we actually build a budget that we could jointly agree to? I think the answer to that question is yes. Senator Warner and I and other members of the Gang of Six and others, there's not just those 6 senators, there's a lot of senators who've been working on this, and I know of probably 40 or 50 senators who would be ready to do it. And if they did it, maybe 60 or 70 would vote for it. But that's not what we have here. I mean, I guess the answer to your question is which amendments which we bring would get accepted if there were if enough of our amendments were accepted that we felt that the budget was changed to one that was was acceptable, I think the answer to your question would be, yeah, we could do it. But I think what you're going to see here, which is the frustration that our ranking member has been expressing, is that a budget from your side has been presented. I think that if you check the vote record when we're all done voting today, the most common vote will be 10 to 12. And it's unfortunate that it will be that way. It'll be a partisan vote on so many of the issues. A few amendments will be accepted from our side, but they won't be the ones that are sufficiently central to the core budget to really get us to the point where a bipartisan deal could be reached. And that's the problem. And so I just wanted to respond to you on that. I think there are a lot of us, and on both sides, who want to get there. But we're not getting there now, and we're not getting there today. Unfortunately, it's very discouraging. And I share I think I heard some discouragement in your question about how we could get there, and I share that.
Senator Portman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be brief, but in further response to your good question and building on what my colleague from Idaho just said, and I agree with Senator Crapo entirely, I've been asked by the media, I'm sure you have, why are you guys going through this, and isn't this going to be counterproductive to the ultimate goal, which I hope all of us have, which is to find some way to come together on these pressing issues. We talked earlier about the entitlement spending problem that has to be addressed. The President has said that publicly and privately. I think this is still a good process to go through. One reason I think so is that we haven't done it for 3.5 years, and it certainly hasn't worked the other way. We really haven't had this debate. So this is an opportunity for you all to put on the table what you think is right. We put on the table what we think is right. There'll be some bipartisanship on some amendments, but for the most part, it's laying out the two opposite positions for our constituents to see. But then I hope at the end of the day that actually is conducive to getting to an agreement by saying, okay, this is what we would have liked in the ideal world. That's not going to happen. But what is going to happen is something to move this country forward. It certainly hasn't worked the other way. Not doing a budget has put us in a position where we've had the biggest deficits in the history of our country and now the largest debt in the history of our country. So I hope that people are not too discouraged by this process, watching it out in the real world, because, yeah, we're not going to agree much on things today. On the floor next week, the same thing will happen for the most part. But then I think once we've staked out our positions, it actually might be helpful, I hope it will be, to finding an agreement.
Senator Portman, I just want to echo those sentiments, and I think that we all have seen that the other way hasn't worked. You have challenged us to produce a budget. As Democrats, we are really trying to do that in a credible way, and I really want to commend all the members of my committee. As you can see, we vary in philosophy all the way across the board. We've had to work very hard to put together a document that we'll be voting out tonight and next week, and hopefully the pathway from there is one that we can come together and solve this problem and get this crisis management behind us and put together a budget, and look forward to working with all of you who are committed to doing that. But the process is that we are putting out a Democratic budget, and we hope to get that out tonight and move it through the floor next week so we can keep moving. So thank you.
I would agree that it's not a wasted effort, and we've learned some things from your perspective, and I hope you've learned some from ours. And at some point, I don't think it's hopeless that in conference something might happen. May not. The President said he was less confident, or I believe the other day, but maybe you never know. But when people have had their opportunity to have their say and articulate their values, I think it might help anyway. So let's hope so.
Are we filibustering, or is there another amendment you want to get to? Okay, I'll wait.
Senator Toomey's amendment that would remove the provisions around biofuels, and it's amendment number 115. And I think it's important to point out that this is really more than a budget issue, and presiding officer knows that because he and I worked together to address this when we passed the defense authorization bill. This is really a national security issue. I had the opportunity as chair of the Water and Power Subcommittee in Energy to go down to Norfolk to have a hearing aboard the USS Kearsarge to talk about exactly what the Navy, and they're reflective of the military, is doing to address energy use, and saw some really amazing progress in terms of their reduction in energy use, their energy efficiency, saw some of the things that they're doing using solar blankets and small compact batteries out in the field. That's really changing their mission, or allowing them to do their mission much better. And what they pointed out is that our access to energy is really complicated by political unrest, by threats to our supply lines around the globe, and we spend billions to protect these fragile supply lines. Oil prices are set on a global market. They're often driven by speculation and rumor, and our military is too often exposed to price shocks. The military consumes about 300,000 barrels of oil a day, which is about $30 million a day. The federal government is the largest consumer of energy in the United States. 93% of that is consumed by the military. And for every dollar rise in a barrel of oil, the Navy incurs a cost of $30 million. Last year, at current prices, last year the Navy incurred a $1.1 billion budget shortfall because the cost of a barrel of oil increased by $38. Now, the commander of the Pacific Fleet was forced to cut $200 million from its flying and steaming costs because of those cost increases. And in fiscal year 11 and 12, the entire Department of Defense came up $5.6 billion short for military operations and maintenance because it had to spend more on fuel than it had anticipated. Now, as I saw down in Norfolk on the Kearsarge, each of our services are making real progress on energy efficiency and on moving to alternative fuels. This is not the time to hinder those efforts. The gallon cost of test quantities of advanced biofuels under the Navy contracts has declined more than 90% over the past 2 years, and it's going to continue to decline. The fact is that the Navy and the Department of Defense have been on the leading edge of innovation and technological achievement over the last 200 years. This is another example of that innovation and technological advancement. Last year, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Jonathan Greenert, sent a letter to my office advocating his strong support for the Navy's efforts on biofuels and urging the Congress to provide him with the flexibility to continue this effort. He said in that letter, and I quote, "I support the Secretary of Navy's efforts to accelerate the establishment of a domestic alternative fuels industry through DPA Title III. This effort will enhance our energy security by diversifying the supply of fuels. Restricting this biofuel effort," as he said, will, quote, "impede America's energy security." I applaud my colleague, Senator Toomey, for the efforts that he has made to look at what we're spending in government to try and reduce those costs. He and I are working very closely to try and reduce the costs of sugar subsidies in this country. But this is a place where, for short-term gain, they would really risk the long-term benefit. And so I would urge my colleagues to oppose the Toomey Amendment and to make sure that our military continues to be on the leading edge of energy security for the world. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. And suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate has been working on the continuing resolution funding the federal government through the end of fiscal year 2013. That would be the end of September. Current spending authority runs out on March 27th. The Majority Leader, Harry Reid, is seated and on the floor, as is the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Senator Mikulski. She's on the floor as well. More than 50 amendments have been offered. Some have been debated and some have been voted on. And Democratic Leader Harry Reid said earlier that he hoped that the Senate can finish the bill tomorrow. That would be Friday. Again, this is the continuing resolution for fiscal year 2013. The Senate's already working on fiscal year 2014 as well. The Budget Committee has been meeting throughout much of the day, and they're working their way through many amendments as they mark up that legislation. And that's live now. We're covering that live now over on our companion network, C-SPAN 3. The House yesterday passed their budget resolution out of committee, and next stop for that is the House floor. The House was in earlier today. They're in general speeches and back tomorrow to finish up work on a bill that deals with federal jobs programs. Follow the House on C-SPAN.
Mr. President.
The Majority Whip, Senator Miller.